Hey, I'm Hogan Gidley. Today, Chad Wolf and I will sit down with a panel of America First issue experts and a recent college graduate to discuss the higher education system just running off the rails, pushing dangerous and destructive ideology like anti-Semitism, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and men competing in women's sports. Welcome to The Tank.
Coming to you from our nation's capital, this is The Tank, your voice in Washington, D.C. and around the country. Broadcasting from the America First Policy Institute offices in D.C., this is the premier think tank podcast where we discuss the challenges facing our nation, talk policy, and advance America First solutions. Welcome to The Tank.
Hello, this is Chad Wolf.
And this is Hogan Gidley.
Hogan, coming up, we're going to sit down with those issue experts that you mentioned to talk about a wide variety of issues occurring on college campuses. But before we do that, we're going to hit on a couple of issues very topical in the news today. And unfortunately, let me just start with one, and that is the news of 3 service members killed in Jordan in the past 24 hours by an unmanned aerial vehicle. 3 killed. I think there was another 20 to 25 injured, unfortunately. Drone is being reported as being, associated with Iranian-backed militias. We know where this is happening. We've seen this before. I think this is like, we're in the 150 or 60 type of attacks on U.S. Personnel in the region.
Yeah, and actually it's more like 40 other people were injured in this,
Is
too.
that right?
So it's even
Okay.
bigger than we first were suspected. Look, this is one of those issues that kind of exposes how important policy is and what we do here at America First. And I recently read, I can't remember who the leader was, but a leader of another nation who said, it turns out that it's not just important to Americans who the American president is, because the world, is impacted by that. And you had a previous administration that peace broke out in the Middle East when all the experts said the moves they were making would lead to war. It didn't. And now what we have is not only attacks with Russia and Ukraine, but what Hamas did to Israel, and now these Iranian-backed militia groups sending in drones and rocket fire into our bases. It is a serious problem, and the notion that somehow responding to that is going to make the region devolve into chaos, it's already chaotic. And I have to say, deterrence only works when you have actions that deter. If you're just talking about it and the current administration says, hey, here's the word, don't, just don't. Okay, but that's not deterrence. That's just language. And you remember the previous administration, President Trump had mentioned, you attack us, you hurt one of our people, you're going to be in big trouble. And then they did that, and what do you know? He killed Soleimani, a massive military leader with Iran, and then what do and then all of a sudden they all pull back, and the tensions kind of die down because they said, no, you're not going to mess with our people. And it just seems like this administration continues to placate to Iran and giving. It's not just the last 3 years. This goes back to the Obama administration, the 8 years where they're giving billions of dollars in cash, pallets of cash to Iran. They're lying to the American people and have since admitted so that Iran was going to kind of moderate and be a good soldier and a good friend on the world stage. That has not happened because their entire ideology is one of death and destruction, not just to Israel, but to America as well.
Well, Hogan, I was told, and I'm sure you remember this, right, that the policies of the Trump administration were going to cause World War III.
Sure.
There was going to be wars breaking out everywhere. The world would be unstable during this period of time. And of course, as you indicated, I think we've seen just the opposite during the policies of the previous administration actually provided breakthroughs in peace in the Middle East. Whereas the policies that we've seen over the last 3 years have, I think at last count, we've had to abandon 5 different embassies around the world.
Yeah.
Because of the decisions being made here and the chaotic nature that we see in certain areas, geographical areas of the world. And it's because of the policies. You can talk about the leadership. It's critically important here. It all goes into this sort of montage here of it not unfolding the way that experts, quote unquote, experts told us that it should be involving, that President Biden is going to bring normalcy. Remember that?
Yep.
Normalcy back to not only here in the United States, but to our posture around the world.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you, it's been anything but that.
The adults are in charge. I hope everyone's calm with this, but I'll tell you, my heart breaks for the families of those people who were killed. And so much of it is just kind of boiled down to bad policy in that region that continues to allow these type of attacks on Americans and American interests. And what do you think is going to happen? Right, sooner or later, we're going to have loss of life, and I'm afraid it's not going to stop for a while if the administration doesn't change its current policy.
Yeah, well, God bless those families that are having to deal with that loss. But I think you said it a minute ago, right, when we talked about President Biden, or at least Biden administration officials saying, "Don't do it."
Yeah, well, they did.
We've heard this before, right? If you go back to the vice president on a different issue, which we're about to jump into.
That's right. You did say that.
She has said, "Don't come." Right, and that's been their message probably for the past 2 years. And of course, we're talking about the southern border. And
hey, but the parallel is very interesting because you said in both instances they said don't do it. Their words were don't, but their policies were do.
Yes.
It's okay, do it.
Yeah. So I think it's I think this is interesting. Look, we're going to jump into the border here just for a minute. It continues to be a topic that I think a lot of Americans are talking about. You've got a couple of different things going on here. You've got obviously the crisis is still raging. We had the month of December, 302,000 illegal apprehensions. That is obviously the highest month ever recorded. And if I sound like a broken record, it's because I am, because every month continues to be worse and worse and worse. If you contrast that with December back in 2019, right before COVID, illegal apprehensions were around 42,000. 42,000 versus 302,000. Those two numbers are dramatically different. But you also have a lot going on with Texas and the Biden administration. Obviously, Biden administration suing Texas on a variety of fronts. And then, of course, you have Secretary Mayorkas in an impeachment hearings that we are about to get underway here.
And also, we've got a few Texas-themed issues to go over in this podcast today. And, you know, they have that saying, don't mess with Texas. And I think the administration is finding out exactly what that means, because we got a lot of things where Texas is standing up to the federal government and saying, we're not going to allow this anymore. And unlike the administration, Texas is actually backing up its words with action, both at the border and with legislation, which we'll get into.
So, you know, a question I get often is does the administration have a plan on what's going on the border? And so there's a couple different ways that you could answer that. But let's go to our first clip, because the White House tries to answer that question.
Sure.
And the Mexicans are really stepping up and trying to do more on their southern border to keep that flow going north lower. And we have seen in recent weeks some success at that. The idea that we don't have a plan or a strategy or we're not taking this seriously is just not borne out by the facts.
It's not borne out by the facts. But the actual opposite is true, right, Hogan? If you just look at the facts, if you look at the last 3 years, if you look at all the decision points that this administration has made, you see the numbers, the illegal apprehensions every month getting worse. You see the number of known or suspected terrorists being picked up increasing. You see everything going in the wrong direction. So the fact that John Kirby says that they have a plan, then there's only one conclusion that you can draw. They're really incompetent. Or you can say they actually have a plan, but the plan is to keep the border open and it's designed to do what we see today. So I'm not sure. Which one do you think it is?
Well, I'll often say this isn't by accident, it's by design. And my friends on the left push back and say, oh, no, Joe Biden doesn't want this. Well, then he's incompetent. That's the only thing, only conclusion you can make, because either it's all a mistake and he can't quite get it right, or he's doing it on purpose, right? Because the reason you know that is because the previous administration didn't have these problems. You hit on some of them. But the Biden administration continues to talk about a congressional fix. Like they're not going to do anything until Congress fixes it. But it's an executive action that got us here. And now the Biden administration is trying to say it's a congressional fix that's required to handle it. That doesn't make any sense. All of this could stop today if the administration would do what it's supposed to do.
You're speaking my language here.
I know.
I mean, I can go off, but let me just say this, that if you recall, in the first 100 days of this administration, they took 94 discrete and separate executive actions on immigration in the first 100 days. And so this idea of, I'm just going to ignore what I did. And now they started off with blaming the Trump administration. They blamed somehow it was the Trump administration's fault. Then they blamed Mexico. They blamed a worldwide migration movement. They've had to turn themselves into pretzels trying to explain this away. And now they have become focused and fixated on this is Congress's fault. Congress didn't take those 94 executive actions. The Biden administration did.
They're called executive actions.
And the strongest thing you can do today to end this crisis can happen overnight and with the stroke of a pen. Whatever they pass on the Hill won't be nearly as strong, nearly as effective as what you can do with the executive action they already have.
Yeah, and so you have states deciding to step up, like the state of Texas, who says, I tell you what, we're going to hold the line here in the great state of Texas. And if the federal government isn't going to enforce the laws on the books and you're going to open us up to invasion, then their argument is constitutionally, we have the right to protect our own borders. So it's a very interesting legal argument for them to make. But, putting up razor wire along the border, saying, no, we're going to do it ourselves then if you can't do it.
Yeah.
And so this sets up an interesting fight with the Supreme Court. And so many other governors and so many other states have now kind of stepped up, 25 of them, in fact, have joined Governor Abbott and say, no, it's his right to defend along the southern border. And, what we're talking about stopping is human trafficking, child smuggling, drugs pouring into our communities. And so that's what Texas is trying to do.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you mentioned razor wire. I think we've got another clip here of, again, the White House spokesperson talking about the importance of razor wire. So let's go to that.
Does razor wire work?
Does razor wire work for what? Does it work for the Border Patrol to allow them to have the access they need to be able to better process people that are trying to get across the border? I don't think so, and that's why we asked for it to be removed.
Whoa. I think he just said the quiet part out loud.
Absolutely. And Kamala Harris has said the same thing.
The
goal is what?
Well,
to process people.
To be able, right? You have John Kirby there saying, well, they don't need razor wire. They don't need razor wire because, quote, to be able to better process people trying to get across the border. This is the fundamental issue at play here. That has been their strategy since day one. Continues to be 3 years into this administration. How do we better? He just said it. You don't have to wonder, right? I've been called all sorts of names because, we've said this has been intentional.
Right.
The White House spokesperson just said it was.
Yeah.
Just said, we need razor wire to be taken down because I need to be able to better process them going forward.
The vice president said the same thing. Kamala Harris, in an interview, I believe last week, said, we got to process people. So what we were told is they're trying to secure the border. And what they're saying is, no, it's a process that we're trying to get back to. And also the hundreds of thousands of people. You said the last year or the last month of the previous administration had 42,000 encounters.
December of 19.
December of 19.
Before COVID.
It's not 300,000. But what did they do when they encountered them? That's also the big difference here. So the previous administration sent them back or made them wait in Mexico. Right. These 300,000 just get let in. And they're just come on.
Well, the greatest thing that the White House and others are saying now is they are, quote, returning more people than the previous administration. That's dubious on its face. But what they fail to tell you is because they're encountering millions and millions and millions and more. Just by the sheer numbers, you're encountering this. And even if you return a small fraction, yes, it's likely more from a numbers count than previous, because your percentage is so much larger.
Of course. This may be a clunky analogy because I'm thinking of it in real time, but it'd be like if a pipe bursts in one of your bathrooms, and so you have to get 2 gallons of water out of your house. Okay, but then the next plumber comes in and takes a wrench to every single pipe in your house and breaks them all. And so now you have to get 150 gallons out, and you're like, hey, we're getting more water out of the house, but you put more water in the house. Yes. Of course.
And so it's things like this where they refuse to be transparent with the American people. I do think they don't think that the American people are paying attention, and they throw out these little lines left and right. And it's really, really infuriating. Let's move along. Obviously, we've got a lot going on here on Capitol Hill regarding the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Mayorkas. I have said for some time that the department needs new leadership. And why did I say that? I think I said that over a year and a half ago, maybe even longer, because it was clear to me, and it was clear to a lot of former officials that the secretary had lost the confidence of his workforce. Mm-hmm. The secretary had lost the confidence of the men and women of the Border Patrol and his law enforcement officials. And when you do that, it's almost impossible to recover.
Yeah.
And so you need new leadership. Now, you build on that with what Republicans in the House have done regarding the things that they're very frustrated and very concerned with Secretary Mayorkas, such as lying to Congress, which is a big no-no, right? That's called perjury. Lying to Congress about having operational control and the border being secure, his abuse of authority, or his lack of enforcing U.S. law, and how all of that is having serious harm and serious implications to Americans sort of across the country.
Sure.
And so Chairman Green of the House Homeland Security Committee has been leading the charge. I think we've got a clip here of him talking about his views regarding the Secretary's work.
Do you believe he will actually be out of the job?
I certainly hope so, Maria. Look, this guy has subverted the laws passed by Congress, ignoring a co-equal branch of government. It's very clear the law says shall detain, and Mayorkas has done everything not to detain.
Yeah, this is what I find so interesting here, too. The executive branch, right, the President of the United States, each branch has its own duty, okay? The legislative branch makes the laws, right? The judicial branch interprets the laws. The executive branch is supposed to enforce the laws.
Wow, that's a novel concept.
This is grade school stuff here. Now, they're not learning about that. They're learning about DEI, which we're getting to momentarily. But nonetheless, they're not enforcing the laws that are on the books. Shall detain? Yeah. And they're not detaining them. They're just letting them out. So we talked about the executive orders that the president can put in place to change this. He can, but there are also laws we already have on the books. Now, plenty of people on the left don't like those laws.
Yeah.
Then you can change them and then enforce new laws. But until that time, there are laws that exist on the books for a reason. And for whatever the motivation, I would argue on purpose, they just want to flood people into this country, and they're allowing it to happen. And forget for a moment the strain it puts on the healthcare system, the education system, first responders, everything locally. The number of people on the terrorist watch list, known or suspected terrorists coming across this country, I mean, every day it seems like they're raising the terror threat levels in this nation. If I'm coming in from a foreign nation overseas to try and hurt America, why would I come into New York City via LaGuardia Airport? Why wouldn't I just fly to Mexico and walk up where they're letting me in without anything? That's what they're doing.
That's what they're doing.
That's my point.
And so I think this is what Republicans, particularly in the House, are saying right now is these aren't just policy differences. These are you're either ignoring the law, you're not enforcing the law, you're lying. These are things that have consequences, and the consequences are what you just outlined, Hogan. We have serious harm to Americans, American communities, and the like. And so that rises to a different level. That's what they're arguing on Capitol Hill this week. And so I think it's going to be interesting to continue to see how this play out. I'll just, I'll kind of cut it off here. My opinion, which you said it before, is the best thing, the best solution to this crisis. Do your job. Do your job, enforce the laws, use executive power, and get this under control. Don't kick the can to Congress, right? And say, you guys solve it. And we have a Senate, negotiated bill in the works. I haven't seen it. It hasn't been released yet, but there's some things in there, such as there are visas for adult children for H-1B holders. Those are high-skilled visas. How does that solve the crisis on the border? answer, it doesn't. It has nothing to do with it. It's not even remotely related to it. But this is Congress at work, which is if I get something, I get something in return, which is crazy when we're in a time of national security. So, again, I could talk a lot about that. But we've got a great group of guests coming on. We're going to talk about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion across college campuses. We see some action being taken in the state of Texas to combat this. We're going to get into it with one of the guests. He's going to talk a little bit about that. And also this rise of anti-Semitism across college campuses. They got some great insights that we're going to hear from very soon on.
Yeah, and as I said, Texas is kind of stealing the show today with some hard work here.
Don't mess with Texas.
That's right. Well, it's pushing back on the administration. Also in their legislature, they have a bill that's out there too to try and combat some of this stuff that basically prevents diversity, equity, and inclusion policies by banning them. Focusing on merit and people as opposed to some radical ideology. And so it's a very interesting show. We're doing something new this time because we don't have just one guest. We've got three from all over the place.
We actually ran out of headphones.
That's right.
We have too many guests for headphones.
Too many guests for headphones. Absolutely. But the knowledge that they are going to give, us, I think is going to really be cool because we get down in the weeds and we talk to someone who actually just graduated from college too and can speak from her own experiences on a college campus. And then someone who's been on the front lines here at AFPI dealing with, this ridiculous notion that men should be able to compete in women's sports. So it's a really good show today. I'm really excited about it.
All right, let's bring in the panel. Well, to talk more about DEI issues writ large, also what we're doing here at the America First Policy Institute, I'm really excited. We've got a panel of AFPI issue experts with us today. And for those of you that listen to the podcast, you're going to know that this is a little different. We usually don't have a group of folks coming in and talking, but this issue is really important. There's a lot of different dynamics to it. And so we wanted to bring in three of our experts here at AFPI, all have different experiences and different expertise in the issue. So I'm going to introduce them really quick, and then we're going to jump right into the discussion. First is, I would say, our head leader here on all things DEI is Jonathan Pidluzy. He has a BA, MA, PhD in political science, which just means he's really, really smart on this issue. Really smart. He was a former associate professor of political science at Morehead State University, taught there for 10 years and later elected as faculty regent, vice president of academic affairs at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, which again, very prestigious group.
He's a prestigious guy.
Well, I'm getting there, Hogan.
Yeah, he is.
And now serves as AFPI's director of higher education reform. So we're going to hear from Jonathan. He's got a lot of insights in this, just a lot of expertise. Excited to have him on. We also have Alex Campagna, who is a former Division I athlete in track and cross country at Pepperdine University, former in the White House Domestic Policy Council, serves here at AFPI as our director for the Center of 1776 and Opportunity Now, and leads on a number of initiatives here at AFPI, including our Athletes for America initiative, as well as our America First Parents initiative. So we're happy to have Alex on. And then last but certainly not least is Samantha Seal, is a recent graduate here at AFPI from the University of Texas. Woohoo, go Texas, at Austin, and has some experiences with all the things that we're going to talk about on college campuses, having just come from a college campus. So really excited to have all three of these folks on. And I think we're just going to jump right into it.
What's really cool, though, is usually we have one guest and we talk. Now we have three folks, so we're going to kind of have a free-flowing discussion with folks from different walks of life and running different things here at AFPI. So I think it's going to be really, really informative. And then someone who just got out of college, which is also helpful.
That's going to be good.
It's been a minute for you. College.
For me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm only a few years out, but you've been much longer.
Okay. There's a couple of different directions to go there, but I'll take the pass. Jonathan, let's bring you into the conversation here because, again, as I indicated, you are the AFPI expert on this. Let me just ask you sort of an open-ended question and have you take it from here, which is just explain to the audience here a little bit about DEI from your perspective. You've been following this issue for some time. Why it seems to be manifesting itself on college campuses. Well, it's manifesting itself everywhere, of course, but really on college campuses. Why is that such a problem come today versus maybe 7 years ago? Maybe folks weren't following it as much. Why should people really pay attention to it now? So what is it? And then why should they pay attention?
Sure. Thanks, Chad. Thanks, Hogan. It's nice to be here. First, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they did a pretty good job branding. What it really does is it divides, it pushes race separation, race essential teachings, and it indoctrinates into an ideology. So we really should work on rebranding DEI as diversity, race exclusion, and indoctrination. The first thing you have to understand is that it's an octopus. It's in every corner of the campus. There's a central office that runs some programs, but there are also committees in every college and every department. It's in the curriculum, so a lot of schools have general education requirements. You have to take a course that satisfies DEI learning outcomes. It's in the first-year orientation. Some universities have it in every syllabus. It shapes hiring. There are universities where you can't even be considered on your academic record or merit unless you check off some diversity boxes for sort of a preliminary review. Universities run bias response teams, so students can actually complain about something that you've said that they find offensive, and it sets off some type of administrative investigation.
When did this all start?
So it probably started about 25 years ago when the Supreme Court said that
Because I think a lot of people have only heard of DEI probably in the last, I would say, 4 to 6 years, if that. But what you're saying is it's always been there.
Well, I think it's been there for decades, but it really got rolling in a big way in the last few years. And then, of course, the George Floyd protests brought it to the surface. But there's been a concerted effort to really transform university campuses and turn them into engines of social transformation. And that's really taken off in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah. So let's take them piece by piece here. On the diversity piece, what are they trying to tell us on the diversity piece? What are the teachings? Same thing with equity and same thing with inclusion. Like what's their theory versus what they're teaching, and what are people learning from that?
Sure. Well, let's start with equity. We probably talk about it the least. I mean, equity wants equal outcomes across identity groups, and you can only get that by basically lowering standards and giving folks credit when they may not deserve it. And so those advocating for equity are actually, they want things like unlimited redos or different ways of grading to equalize outcomes. Inclusion is not really about inclusion. That's where we get a whole bunch of like race exclusion. So, for example, some universities have dorms that are for African-American students. Universities are running different graduations or different graduation ceremonies for different identity groups. And then diversity is really about changing the makeup of the faculty and the makeup of the students, right? And so you actually look at identity characteristics when you're choosing faculty, or you look at identity characteristics in the admissions process.
So 2 questions. When we talk about equity, is that the same thing as equality?
Absolutely not, right? So
Okay.
we want equality of opportunity. This is a foundational American ideal, right? It's what the civil rights movement fought to establish. Everyone is treated equally based on merit and character. Equity wants equal outcomes across identity groups. And so you look at the grade makeup of a particular class and you flog the professor if the wrong people aren't getting the best grades.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people that maybe don't follow this day in and day out, like yourself and others across the country, may just sit back and say, okay, diversity, equity, inclusion. I can get on board with that. Why is it a bad thing?
Well, one of the most pernicious things that it does is it teaches young people to make snap judgments based on race, right? It teaches people to look at each other based on race and sex characteristics primarily. And the other thing it does is it sets up a viewpoint orthodoxy on campuses, right? So you have these bias response teams or speech codes that basically make it possible for folks on one side of the political aisle to set off a burdensome investigation if you say something someone else doesn't like. So we've had examples of bias response investigations because one student had Ben Shapiro on in a college dorm room.
Okay.
Really?
Yeah. So,
Interesting.
but the dangers of this seem quite far-reaching and problematic in a lot of ways. You're talking about flagging a student if they say the wrong thing or have the wrong guest attend a speech, et cetera. So talk a little bit about more. Chad had asked you why it's wrong. Tell me some of the dangers that you see coming out of this type of thought process and what it does to a culture, what it does to a country, to not just, it's one thing to want equality of opportunity, which is fine. You're saying equity means the outcome has to be the same for everybody, regardless of merit, regardless of effort, regardless of grade, regardless of anything. Tell us why you think that's so dangerous.
Sure. So DEI is self-consciously an offshoot of critical race theory. And critical race theory teaches that America is systematically oppressive and that we need wholesale reform. And so what DEI aims to do is use every lever at a university to shape the next generation of teachers, lawyers, activists, journalists, and parents so that they go out into the world and use their authority in all of those spheres to change the way people think and therefore to change policy and really to engineer us away from our founding ideals.
So you've worked on college campuses previously. What's a couple of examples, or what did you see firsthand as some of this started to manifest itself?
Yeah, so I was on a college campus at the end of when things were sort of sane, and I was on a campus that didn't have a lot of these problems. I think part of the reason is that I was on a less prestigious campus, and I don't think that the less prestigious and the less wealthy campuses have the same degree of problems. We just couldn't invest 10 or 20 or Berkeley $30 million a year into diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what you see is you see it in mandatory training for students, mandatory training for faculty. It's part of the hiring process for faculty. So at every step of the way, a chief diversity officer might have to sign off on a personnel action. They're working it into tenure and promotion review. So if you haven't done something to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, something concrete, you might have trouble actually getting tenure. They're even using it at some universities to review departmental programs. So if your program isn't making a contribution to diversity, equity, and inclusion, then the chair gets in trouble. Right now, that's problematic because it creates really strong incentives to bring all this ideology into the classroom and the curriculum as well.
Sure. Well, you're talking about the classroom, and thankfully we have someone in here who's just out of the classroom. Samantha, you've been part of the AFPI team for a while now, but one of the reasons we thought it was important for you to come in here was because you're kind of fresh off of the college campus and you're experiencing a lot of the things that Jonathan's talking about. So kind of share your experience in college. What did you see? I mean, UT Austin isn't necessarily the most conservative campus on the planet. A lot of lefties run around over there. Keep Austin weird, I think, is their little phrase, if I'm not mistaken.
It just
for
kills
Austin,
me
Texas.
that it sits in the middle of Texas, but nevertheless. Geographically.
Sure, whatever.
Spot there.
Sure. You obviously went to SMU, Chad, which is a far better institution for a million reasons.
I agree with that.
I do
It's
not
true.
agree.
That's
but
not
okay.
a joke. That's true.
Facts.
So tell us a little bit about your experiences and what you saw in the DEI space there on a college campus.
Well, unfortunately, DEI was very pervasive on my college campus. Like Jonathan was saying, bias training was a part of mandatory freshman orientation. So I had to take that as a freshman and wasn't really educated on what DEI was. So I was unaware of what was being indoctrinated into me at that time until I came to the America First Policy Institute and began to learn more about DEI. Every professor had to have DEI statements in their syllabi, like Jonathan was also mentioning, and even student organizations were required by their deans and their faculty advisors to have DEI statements. And I was actually president of the Texas Public Relations Student Society of America. And instead of focusing on our core mission of training the next generation of communication professionals, I was often distracted by requests from my dean or people higher up in the Moody College of Communication to post diversity, equity, and inclusion statements on our website, contribute to the DEI initiatives of our college in some way, or even promote events such as the Future of DEI in Higher Education hosted by the Queer, Trans, Black, Indigenous, People of Color Agency. Not making that up. And so I had to choose between listening to my dean and saving that rapport with her, or staying true to my conservative beliefs and realizing that, those words are just veils for woke ideology.
So give me an idea. So obviously UT is a very large campus. You've got, I think it was 60,000 back in the day. I'm sure it's grown much more beyond that. Are incoming freshmen, or really anyone enrolled in the school, is it sort of just like accepted? Like this is just part of life. This is what we do? Or were there others? It seems like you started to question this a little bit. Were there others on campus saying, hey, I'm not sure like this is really part of what our education system should be about?
There are a few people, a select group, at least in my major. I mean, my major only had 75 people. I was a public relations major that began to question the DEI initiatives that were being pushed on us, but also the pervasiveness of DEI depended on what major that you were in. whether it was communications, liberal arts, science, etc. And so some people like me would speak up in our classes, in our ethics classes, when DEI would be pushed on us in our ethics classes that were required. But a lot of the times people would just sit back and listen because they didn't want to be neglected by their peers, or they didn't want to be shut down by their professors either.
Now, did you have to be taught to hate Texas A&M, or is that just part of the...
That's actually part of the indoctrination.
Okay,
that's part of our mandatory training.
Okay,
too.
I just want to make
Look
sure.
at this, Hogan. You're going deep into Texas here.
Well,
From
no,
some
I'm
guy
just
from
saying,
both Arkansas and Mississippi.
Yeah, but I understand the hatred there. So it's interesting. My point in making that joke was, okay, you don't like A&M, you don't like TCU, you don't like, whatever, SMU, whatever.
No, they love this.
Yeah, you don't like Texas Tech. I get it. But now you're teaching people to hate on the basis of other factors that obviously are more insidious and that carry with you throughout life, throughout your careers. It's kind of an indoctrination tactic, so to speak. I think one of those areas that we've seen that rear its head too is trying to have men compete in women's sports.
Yeah.
And Alex Campana in here as well to have the conversation kind of about where that is. And Alex, you have been listening, and we're all having a free-flowing discussion here about kind of the problems as we see them. Talk a little bit about the challenges that you faced, and not just exposing the ideology, the ridiculous notion that a man can become a woman and vice versa, but that you're allowing men to compete in sports with women. Talk a little bit about what you've uncovered and how problematic that is too.
Well, luckily at Pepperdine, I didn't experience any men in women's sports, but had I, being a track and cross country runner, the entire integrity of the sport would have just fallen apart. When you're a Division I athlete, there's hours and hours and hours that go into training. I probably trained for 4 or 5 hours each and every day. So knowing that I was going to potentially be stepping on the track and racing against a man and had no chance of winning, all hope would have been lost. And to be honest with you, if that was a problem I was facing, I don't know that I would have continued on as an athlete. For me, I was training and I was competing to win. I wasn't training and competing to take second place. And when you're competing against a man, it's scientifically proven that they have numerous advantages in sports. So, like I said, I think the entire integrity of the sport would have been compromised. I think it's absolutely crazy that this is still happening. We just saw it happen in golf. It's happening in sports all over. And it really, to me, it comes down to this radical ideology, like Jonathan was suggesting, perverting reality. I mean, you could say that a man is a woman and a woman is a man, but it's just simply untrue. It's biologically untrue. We know it's not a reality. And the fact that we continue to let this happen is, in my eyes, extremely problematic. And then when you go beyond just the integrity of sports, you think about the safety and the security of women's spaces, women's locker rooms. You don't want to be changing in a locker room in front of men. And we've seen that happen. That happened with Riley Gaines. That's one of the main reasons that she decided to speak out. You don't want to be in a restroom with a biological male. These spaces that used to be safe for women are now compromised. And I think that's also a huge problem with what we're seeing.
Yeah, Alex, Riley Gaines, obviously one of the most famous people who brought this kind of into the mainstream about the problems she saw with what was happening with the swimming, with a man being able to compete in her sport. There's so many stories that have now come out having to do with that particular individual's own mental problems, et cetera. But there was a recent story that came out too. You talked about how this continues, but there's like and you have the details. I don't, but I remember seeing something come up in the news feed about like a 50-year-old man identifying as like a 12-year-old girl or something and competing with kids. It's true. You're looking at me
You
crazy.
making this up?
Do what?
You making this up?
I am not. Alex, are you familiar with this or no?
I've never heard of this.
Yes, I am familiar with this. I don't have, all the details, but this is happening. We've now taken, when we denied the basic truth that there's man and woman, now they're denying the basic truth of age. They're saying, okay, I identify as this age, so I'm going to compete in this age. And it's absolutely crazy. A lot of parents, I'm a mom and I would do this for my daughter. They've decided, I'm just going to pull my kid out of this sport. If this happens, if there's a man, especially a 50-year-old man competing against my young daughter, okay, I'm done. She's just out. She's not going to compete anymore. But that's really sad. And honestly, that goes exactly against what Title IX was originally created for. Jonathan's an expert in Title IX, so I can let him weigh in on this. But that was designed to give women an opportunity. And here we are, years later, taking away all the opportunity we fought so hard to give women.
You read my mind, Alex. Jonathan, I want to get you in here because, we started talking about DEI, the diversity aspect of that, right? I assume that's what we're seeing here and what Alex is describing and what Hogan's still trying to do a little research there on the 50-year-old. But
I've got it.
Okay, well, we'll get there. But this whole idea of being a diverse college campus is one thing, right? Making sure you make sure that students feel welcomed, right? It's a higher education campus of sorts. But that then bleeds into collegiate sports where as Alex so rightfully pointed out, men and women are created biologically different from one another, and men have larger muscle size, larger lung. It's just science, right? And so how they compete on a playing field or on a track or wherever it might be is very different than how women compete. And so I assume it's just all tied together, but let me.
Yeah, you use the word welcoming. I think that's the right word to use. We want campuses that are welcoming to everyone. What's happened, though, is that this mania for DEI focuses on victim identity. And what it tries to do is completely remake the campus so that those who can claim to be the most victimized have opportunities that start to infringe upon fairness for others, right? Yeah. And so women, trans women, so biological males, right, who have all of these advantages that come from an andronidized body, right? So muscle mass, bone density, just the way that the proportions work. They make the argument that in order for them to be included, right, they have to have all access to female facilities, female sports, and no one cares about the fairness, right? And there's a rank injustice about men and women competing together.
Okay. So I have this story up here. So
you found it.
No, I've had it. It's a 50-year-old trans swimmer who identifies as a teenage girl, has been swimming in these competitions with these teenage girls. Okay. So I guess all kinds of dangers that Alex pointed out with men and women's locker room, the perversion of why do they want to compete with them? Obviously, I've never seen someone do the opposite. I've never seen girls say they want to compete in men's sports. It's very different. It looks like this guy has a lot of issues, no question about it. But when things like this begin to occur and begin to come commonplace, again, it's like the first thing we were talking about, the danger of this, not to mention the fact Title IX, the fights that the women had to go through to be put on equal footing to get same treatment. Now, all of a sudden, it's like if a bunch of guys decided they were all women, they could go to these college campuses and take all the scholarships from women and just say, yep, we're women, we're going to take it. Then it just kind of erode and destroy the very thing they were fighting for in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, one of its great legacies is to open up opportunity for women in collegiate athletics. Right? So it requires that there be roughly equal opportunity for men and women. Now, what the present administration is trying to do is read into Title IX the words gender identity and sex characteristics. What that would do is it would force universities to treat as a woman anyone who claims a female gender identity. And so as you say, this means that all of a sudden men can compete for female spots, men can compete for female scholarships, which will in fact erode the Title IX and its great achievements.
Okay, maybe I'm just slow on the uptake here then a little bit, right? Because I think what we were taught at higher education campuses is that, liberalism, feminist, right? And that whole movement was about providing equal access to women, right? And making that playing field level. But Jonathan, I think what you just described is it's actually not, right? In that the left now,
right,
because they've embraced this ideology of sorts, it's actually having the reverse happen.
Yeah, if the Title IX rule is finalized, you're going to be able to complain to the Federal Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education if your teachers don't use the right pronouns, or if you don't have access to female intimate facilities, right? And, a lot of women aren't comfortable undressing with men. And so that will inevitably deprive them of opportunities to make full use of the campus and its programs.
Okay, real quickly, you said, Samantha, you had something on this?
I got in trouble for using the wrong pronouns with my professor while I was on campus, actually. So
just give us a flavor of what that entailed exactly.
So my professor is a biological female, but she preferred the pronouns they, them. And I did not use those pronouns because that's illogical. That's not biological. And so I started using her correct biological pronouns, she, her, and I got in trouble with her and with my other classmates. And
when you say in trouble, did she penalize what you eventually got in that class, or was it just like, I'm going to ignore Samantha because she's not playing by my rules?
My grade was not penalized, thankfully, but I got called into her office, and it was actually with Texas Public Relations Student Society because she was involved in that organization. So we had to have a meeting, and she asked me to use correct pronouns for her and for the students of that organization. And so I just started using everybody's last name. I said, okay, I'm not going to play by the rules of your game, but I'm not going to compromise my beliefs either. So We're going to compromise, and I'm going to use your last name instead.
All right. So this is all extremely fascinating. It's terrifying on the same side of it. But let's kind of go in a different direction here, because we've been talking about the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, the problems with men and women's sports. But I will say COVID was a horrible thing. If there was one silver lining we got, it was that parents got to take a look behind the curtain and see what kids were learning in grade school, which was shocking. And you talked about critical race theory, the America hatred, all the things that these kids were learning and being indoctrinated with at an early age. But if there's one thing we can kind of glean from another horrible tragedy, which was Hamas, killing Jews and starting a war in that region, was the fact that we got to take a peek behind the curtain here in this country as to what kids are now learning in college campuses as well. So talk a little bit about, Jonathan, what we've seen and that piece of the indoctrination side, because I was on a show recently and someone said, can you believe what our kids are now learning in college? And I said, now learning? Where do you think these teachers learned it? This is not new. They learned it in college also. So this is generations of learning this type of anti-Semitism, this type of hatred for the Jewish people. So explain and unpack a little bit of that for us too.
Sure. I want to start with a statistic. So a December Harvard University Harris poll found that 67% of respondents age 18 to 24 believe that, quote, Jews as a class are oppressors and should be treated as oppressors. I think that helps us to understand that this grotesque anti-Semitism on the left on university campuses that we've seen explode in the last 4 months, it's the flip side of the DEI coin, right? DEI says, understand everyone in terms of their identity, right? View the world in terms of oppressors and oppressed. And DEI codes anyone with power or anyone who has resources as the oppressor. So Jews are oppressors according to this DEI mindset. Other anti-colonial and intersectional ideologies are teaching the same thing. And so this makes Palestinians very perversely victims, right? And so the Hamas terrorist becomes the victim. They're the good guy, and they're the people that college students are primed to root for. Right. So again, this new left anti-Semitism really is fueled and primed by the DEI that's taken over the campus.
It's just, it's fascinating. Obviously, I grew up in a different time. I'm just a couple of years younger than Hogan, but whether it was high school, whether it was college, the idea of what you see on college campuses now regarding anti-Semitism, you would have never envisioned it just a couple of 10 years ago. No, I'm kidding. 20 years ago, right? You would just never, it would never come up because of I'm not going to say the education, but what you were taught, right? I mean, we had a firm grasp of World War II. We had a firm grasp of what the Jewish people went through. We sort of understood it all. And again, Jonathan, as you're describing it sounds like, unfortunately, and I've got 2 kids who will be in the higher education systems very, very soon, it's a totally different way to educate them. And they're getting just a perverse view of the world, and particularly of the Jewish people.
Yeah, so I think young people, again, they're primed to see the world in this very tribal way, right? Judge people by group identity. You're either good or bad based on whether you're a victim or not. Then we have alarming historical ignorance, right? That leaves college students as essentially...
Alarming historical ignorance. That's a great line, by the way, but go ahead. I love that.
I mean, young people go to college and they're essentially empty vessels, right? And then you have ideological faculty, right, who are trying to teach a narrative around Israel and Palestine. And one of the things that we know is that there's a ton of foreign money that's coming from the Gulf to elite institutions. These fund the radical Arab studies and the radical Middle East studies departments. And their purpose is to turn those parts of the university into propaganda instruments.
I mean, that's fascinating. And I think we've talked a lot at AFPI about the amount of Chinese influence in higher education systems and on universities. But I think what you're now saying is, well, that may be occurring, but there's actually influence from the Middle East and other countries there to persuade students, higher education students, on a different outlook of life.
Yeah, just in the last 5 or 6 years, there have been billions of dollars in gifts from the Gulf, right? There are some new reports highlighting this. The last administration tried to really strengthen foreign gift reporting and force universities to report about the purpose of the gifts as well as the amount. That's been abandoned by the current administration. The other thing to keep in mind is that foreign students come to U.S. campuses with the purpose of being activists on this issue and really also trying to sort of reshape the conversation. There are scholarship programs run by Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organizations that send foreign students to the campus to, again, change the conversation.
So one of the things that kind of sparked some controversy, some outrage, some protests were the things that happened on these Ivy League campuses, especially when they came to testify. The presidents came to testify in front of Congress, and they refused to condemn Hamas. They refused to condemn anti-Semitism for the most part. And one of the points that so many on the right made was, if this were any other group, if this were a college president refusing to condemn verbal attacks, physical attacks on black people, on gay people, whatever, they would have been run out of that college in 2 seconds. But for some reason, the Jews fall in this little weird category of that's the exception. You can do whatever you want to them. Obviously problematic, obviously evil, obviously wrong. But do you think this argument going to the highest levels of, once esteemed, cornerstone institutions like Harvard, that level of awareness, do you think that has had a positive effect on people seeing that going, wait, what is my money going to? And why are all these people from other countries coming in? And, are we following the money here? It looks like other nations are trying to influence our kids so that they have a stranglehold on policy in the future. Like, I'm muddling a question here, but it's just like, was that kind of a real big catalyst in this argument that allowed people to see what's really going on?
Yeah, I think your analogy is exactly right. You couldn't say these things about any other group. And I think the reason why the university presidents couldn't condemn anti-Semitism is pretty simple, really. The DEI left is probably the most powerful constituency on an elite campus, right? I mean, we're talking tens of millions of dollars funding faculty positions, staff positions, student organizations, lectures.
That's incredible.
It's like a politician. You pay the piper, you call the tune. If a politician has big funding from a certain group, that group has a foothold in the door to get them to vote a certain way. You're saying it's the same thing here.
Exactly. So this is me speculating, but I think they workshop their statements very carefully, and their primary goal was not to anger the DEI left. And so they thought that they could sort of flip a historically right argument and concern about free speech into a shield of sorts to avoid having to condemn progressive anti-Semites. So that's what I think their thinking was. I do think it will be wholesome, because I think university presidents have gotten to where they are responding to one constituency and one constituency only, that powerful left DEI constituency. I think this demonstrates to university presidents around the country that they have a personal stake and interest, their job, in really ensuring that they're starting to do something to protect Jewish students.
Sam and Alex, let me get you back in here because I'd love to get your views on, obviously you're neither of you are in school any longer in college, but had you been perhaps your last year and these statements were being made by your president of your university before Congress, as the three Ivy Leagues did, would that have resonated on your college campuses, or would it just been sort of like a blip on the radar? And I'm gonna go back to studying and do what I do every day. I'm curious to try to understand people on those campuses, or should it have occurred at yours, what would have been the impact?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was actually finishing my last semester of school after the attacks on Israel on October 7th, and there were protests on campus. There was a walkout on Kristallnacht with Hamas sympathizing groups that professors actually told their classes to go to. It took a week for our university president to put out a statement that basically meant nothing. Like Jonathan was saying, it was pandering to the DEI left, and we talked about it in our classes. And it did not make either side of the argument happy. And the fact that it took him a week to put out a statement, I mean, respect to President Jay Hartzell, appreciate the good things he has done for our university, but that was really unfortunate that it took him a week to talk about the tragic lives that were lost in that massacre. And there's still danger going on at that campus and attacks against Jewish students. I have a lot of friends who are Jewish on that campus, and I was just talking to them this past weekend, and they still don't feel safe with this new semester starting. There's still protests going on when they bring in Jewish speakers to talk about the war that's going on. And so I just keep them in my prayers and hope that things get better there on campus.
But we've been told for the longest time, right, higher education campuses are all about diversity of thought, diversity of ideas. And that's where you go to express that and to really lean into that. But if, folks don't feel comfortable, presentations, or I should say lectures or whatever it might be, getting canceled because of this. I mean,
one side feels comfortable.
Well, that's
right.
That's the point I'm getting to. Alex, I know you've been gone from college here not nearly as long as Hogan, but I'm curious to get any of your thoughts.
Can you hear that, Alex? Can you hear that squeaking on your end of the line, or no? We call Chad the Tin Man because his joints sound like the Tin Man after a 2-day rain.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's so old. I hope it's not distracting because here in the studio, it's very, very loud. But go ahead.
Well, yes, I'm definitely not nearly as old as you or Chad Hogan.
Boom.
But I was fortunate enough to go to Pepperdine. And while many universities, I think, have just completely gone off the deep end, and, they've honestly just become radically left, Pepperdine, I think, has held true to its Church of Christ values, and the leadership at Pepperdine has been pretty committed to viewpoint diversity, is what they're calling it. And the president and the dean of Pepperdine actually came out and in the wake of all of this, and they stood up for the students that were pro-Israel. They stood against all the anti-Semitism that was happening on campuses. So I do think there's still some hope in some of these smaller private universities to preserve those values. But then I will say, I have 2 siblings that are at CU Boulder, and it's the complete opposite there. Similar experience to what Sam is describing. And none of those values are upheld. They're really, really nervous to speak out against anything that's happening. Their teachers are constantly, speaking against what's going on, speaking in support of Hamas. And it's really sad to see. I do just feel like there is still a little glimpse of hope when I see things like what Pepperdine's doing and what some of these other smaller, more religious universities are doing.
That may be the last hope to try and to give students an honest education.
Let me just jump in real quick, as this obviously is a great conversation. It's also frightening, right?
Very.
Again, I've got 2 sons who are hopefully going to college. We'll be going to college here very soon in the next couple of years, and they're going to have to confront all of this. And you've got to start talking to them now while they're in high school. And this isn't a conversation that's easy to do with, two boys who this is like the last thing on their mind, but they need to be aware of it, it sounds like.
Yeah. And listen, Alex, we thank you so much for your time and your insight. Samantha, you as well. Jonathan, appreciate the work you're doing, but I do want to finish with this. We've talked about the problems, and one of the things we're so focused on here at AFPI is not just recognizing the issue, but how do you solve it? How do you fix it? And you don't want to throw up your hands and say it's too far gone. But so much of this starts with accepting reality and exposing what is happening, and then trying to get people to believe it's happening and then give them solutions. So I'm looking at you going, hey, we know these things are going on. We've seen the pushback on college campuses that Samantha was describing. We know the money flowing in is hard to ignore because you're getting paid and they want you to do certain things for that money. And if you don't, they'll just take that money and give it to another campus. This is a simple question, but a very difficult one, I think, to actually diagnose. But I'm gonna give it to you anyway as we kind of wrap this segment. And that is, how do you fix it? How do you begin to kind of peel this back and stop this from happening on college campuses?
Yeah, Hogan, that's a long conversation, but I think the place that it starts is at public universities. We have to start defunding DEI. There are two really good models, the Florida model and the Texas model. It's just going into effect in Texas this semester, actually. So what the Texas legislature did is they defunded DEI offices, but they also forbid mandatory DEI training or the use of any type of DEI or political litmus test in faculty hiring. And so now the question is going to be, how do we enforce all of that? On anti-Semitism, I think that university presidents have to say, we're going to enforce our prohibitions against any kind of harassment or discrimination when it comes to shared ancestry. So that includes Jewish ancestry in exactly the same way we looked at race discrimination or race-based harassment. And we just need better leadership. So governing boards have to hire presidents who are committed to viewpoint diversity.
Yeah. It's about governors, it's about legislatures that not just do what the will of the people want, but also stand up for what's right. And that's, again, why so much of this matters.
Yeah, and it's glad to hear that we've got at least a couple of models to look at and try to build off of. But again, that's just two, right? And this is happening across the country. A lot to unpack here. We could probably go on for another hour or two really discussing this. Let me thank the guests. Jonathan, obviously, you do great work here at AFPI. All the guests do. Alex, Samantha, appreciate you guys joining us today, sharing your experiences, but also maybe some solutions and really what we need to pay attention to as this continues to move forward. So make sure you subscribe today so you don't miss any upcoming episodes of The Tank, and we'll see you next time.
Text the word TANK to 70107. That's TANK to 70107 to get exclusive content from the Tank podcast and to learn more about the America First Policy Institute.